On a July morning in 1959, the gates of a small funeral home in Los Angeles opened to a day that should have been marked by mourning and celebration of a life well lived. Instead, what unfolded was one of Hollywood's most haunting realities, a farewell so empty, so stripped of dignity, that it would define the legacy of a man who had once captivated millions. George Reeves was Superman, not just in costume and on screen, but in the hearts and minds of an entire generation of children who believed that beneath that cape and bright costume was a real hero who could save them. Yet on the day his body was laid to rest, fewer than a dozen people gathered to say goodbye. The gates remained quiet. The cameras stayed away. Hollywood, the industry that had built him up, simply looked the other way. This is the story of why. To understand the emptiness of that funeral, we must first understand the fullness of George Reeves' rise. Born George Kaffir Brewer in the small Iowa town of Woolstock in 1914, Reeves came into the world already marked by instability. His parents separated almost immediately after his birth, setting a pattern of displacement and uncertainty that would haunt him throughout his childhood. His mother, Helen, shuttled him between states, Kentucky, Illinois, and eventually California, searching for some elusive stability that never quite materialized. When she married Frank Basolo, an Italian businessman, young George finally seemed to find a home. He was adopted and given a new surname, Reeves. It felt like a fresh start, a new beginning. But that too would collapse. By the time George was a teenager, his stepfather had abandoned the family, and his mother delivered devastating news. Frank had committed suicide. For decades, George Reeves believed this lie. The truth that his stepfather had actually lived until 1944 came much later, long after George had already built walls around his heart to protect himself from further betrayal. Despite this turbulent childhood, George discovered a refuge in performance. At Pasadena High School and Pasadena Junior College, he found solace in acting, singing, and boxing. These weren't just hobbies. They were survival mechanisms for a young man desperate to escape his fractured past. At the Pasadena Playhouse, one of Hollywood's most respected acting schools, he refined his craft and caught the attention of major studios. In 1939, he landed a small but memorable role in Gone with the Wind, one of cinema's greatest epics. It was a foot in the door, a promise of things to come. Warner Brothers took notice and signed him, changing his stage name to George Reeves, a name they believed sounded better on a marquee. Throughout the early 1940s, he appeared in films alongside James Cagney and Ronald Reagan, but the parts remained small and the recognition elusive. Typecast as a supporting actor, he struggled to break free from the mold that studios had carved out for him. His film career never quite ignited into stardom, despite his talent and potential. When World War II arrived, Reeves made the decision to enlist in the United States Army Air Forces, setting aside his fledgling Hollywood career to serve his country. When he returned from the war in 1945, he hoped that his military service would rehabilitate his standing in the industry. Instead, he found an industry in decline. Studios were cutting costs, closing production units, and closing their doors to actors who hadn't already established themselves as bankable stars. Desperate for work, Reeves took whatever he could find, low-budget westerns, supporting roles in B-movies, and when even those dried up, work outside the industry entirely. The man who had appeared in one of Hollywood's greatest films found himself digging cesspools just to pay his rent. Pride, he learned, was a luxury he could no longer afford. In 1951, salvation arrived in an unexpected form, a television project called Superman and the Atom Men, which was being developed as both a low-budget film and a pilot for a television series titled Adventures of Superman. Reeves was offered the lead role. For an actor who had spent years chasing respect in the film industry, accepting a role in television felt like admitting defeat. Television was considered beneath serious actors, a second-class medium for washed-up performers and bit players. But Reeves needed the work. He accepted the role, uncertain that it would change his life in ways both wonderful and devastating. The show premiered in 1952, and overnight, George Reeves became a household name. His calm demeanor, his strong presence, and his approachable charm brought Superman to life in a way that felt authentic to millions of children. Parents trusted him. Children adored him. And Reeves himself embraced the responsibility that came with being the physical embodiment of their greatest hero. He refused to smoke in public, quit smoking entirely to maintain Superman's image, and signed autographs with genuine warmth and patience. On set, his dressing room bore a sign, "Honest George, the people's friend." He lived up to that motto every single day. But the same fame that elevated him also imprisoned him. The contract that bound Reeves to the Superman role prevented him from pursuing other acting opportunities. Casting directors, once willing to see his range and potential, now saw only the Man of Steel. Producers kept him locked into the role that had made him famous, content to milk the show for as long as audiences remained interested. What had begun as George Reeves' big break gradually transformed into a cage, one that grew smaller and more confining with each passing season. The typecasting was absolute and merciless. In their eyes, he was not an actor who could play Superman. He was Superman and nothing else. By the mid-1950s, Reeves had achieved the kind of fame most actors dream of, yet it brought him neither the freedom nor the respect he craved. Adventures of Superman ran for over 100 episodes. Public appearances kept him constantly busy. He visited children in hospitals, posed for photographs with adoring fans, and appeared as Superman on a 1957 episode of I Love Lucy, cementing his place in American popular culture. The irony was crushing. He had achieved fame, but he had achieved it in the one way that ensured he could never escape it. Privately, Reeves was drowning. His salary, though steady, was modest by Hollywood standards. In the early years, he earned as little as $1,000 per episode. By the final years, it had risen to $2,500 a week, but filming lasted only a few weeks each year, leaving him in financial instability for the remainder of the time. He had dreams of directing, of starring in dramatic films that would showcase his range as an actor, of creating his own projects that would allow him to step out from behind the cape. He wrote and pitched a television series called Port of Entry, an adventure drama he hoped to film in Hawaii and Mexico. No investor would touch it. To Hollywood, he was Superman and only Superman, a man defined entirely by a single role, with no room for evolution or growth. As the 1950s progressed, Reeves grew increasingly isolated. His relationships became complicated and controversial. He had been romantically involved for years with Toni Manx, the wife of powerful MGM executive Eddie Manx, a man with rumored ties to organized crime. When he ended that relationship and became engaged to socialite Leonore Lemon in 1959, tension erupted. Friends noticed a desperate optimism in him, a hope that engagement might offer him some measure of happiness and stability. But they also saw exhaustion in his eyes, a weariness that seemed to deepen with each passing day. By June 1959, George Reeves was 45 years old. He was famous but boxed in, admired by the public, yet struggling terribly behind the scenes. The man who had been Superman to millions had been abandoned by the industry that had made him. Casting directors wouldn't see him for dramatic roles. Major productions wouldn't consider him. His only value, in the eyes of Hollywood's gatekeepers, was as the embodiment of a comic book character that audiences were finally growing tired of watching. On the night of June 15, 1959, George Reeves hosted a gathering at his home in Benedict Canyon. His fiancée, Leonore Lemon, was there, along with several friends. They drank and celebrated, and the mood grew loud and boisterous. Reeves, tired, excused himself and went upstairs to bed. Later, he briefly returned to complain about the noise before retiring once again. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. What happened in that bedroom remains one of Hollywood's great unsolved mysteries. A handgun was found, wiped clean of fingerprints. There were unexplained marks on his body, inconsistencies in the evidence, and questions about the sequence of events that night. Leonore Lemon's cryptic remarks, telling the others that George was going upstairs and then, after the shot rang out, saying, "See, I told you," fueled theories that would persist for decades. The official investigation concluded quickly. The death was ruled a suicide, blamed on depression and career frustration. But inconsistencies haunted the case. No fingerprints on the weapon. A long delay before police were called. Multiple bullet casings, and a mark on the ceiling that didn't align with the official narrative. Questions multiplied. Was it truly a suicide, an accident, or something darker? Something involving the powerful people whose reputations and secrets George Reeves might have threatened? The answer, if it ever existed, died with George Reeves on that June night. When news of his death broke, fans expected a farewell befitting a cultural icon. After all, he had been Superman to an entire generation. Schools released statements. Children wept. Yet when the funeral arrived on July 1st, 1959, the reality was starkly, painfully different. Only a handful of people attended. His mother Helen, his attorney, and a few close friends. Not a single major Hollywood star came. The media barely covered the service. For the public, it passed almost entirely unnoticed. Why such silence? Why such emptiness? Fear played a significant role. Reeves' death was surrounded by scandal and suspicion. Theories of suicide, accident, or murder filled headlines. The affair with Tony Manx, wife of an MGM executive with organized crime connections, created dangerous complications. Few in the industry were willing to risk angering Eddie Manx or his associates by publicly supporting the dead man. Attending the funeral of someone at the center of such controversy could be career suicide, a way of signing oneself onto the wrong side of Hollywood's silent power struggles. But there was more to the emptiness than fear. Reeves had been systematically isolated by his Superman role. The typecasting that had defined his professional life had also defined his social standing in the industry. He was no longer considered part of Hollywood's inner circle. His peers had drifted away. Even co-stars from Adventures of Superman did not publicly attend his funeral. Whether this was deliberate avoidance, fear of association, or simple neglect, the effect was the same. A man who had been the most famous actor in America was laid to rest as if he were nobody. For his mother Helen, the loneliness of that day mirrored her own grief. Rather than stage a grand public ceremony, she poured her energy into pursuing answers about her son's death. She hired private investigators and famous attorney Jerry Gisler to dig deeper into the official narrative, questioning whether the authorities had truly uncovered the truth. The investigation eventually revealed unexplained bruises and other inconsistencies, but nothing strong enough to overturn the official ruling. And so George Reeves was buried not with the honor of a hero, but with the silence of a ghost. His funeral was not just an end to an actor's life. It was a mirror held up to an industry's cruelty, to the price of fame bought at the cost of human identity, to the willingness of power structures to discard and forget those who are no longer useful. George Reeves had given the world Superman, had embodied the hope and strength that millions of people believed in. But in the end, he died alone and was mourned alone, abandoned by everyone except those who truly loved him. That is why nobody showed up. That is the tragedy beneath the tragedy. Like, subscribe, and follow for more.